Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in Spanish and French literature. Longtime listeners know that I like to begin these talks sometimes with this question of why am I reading or rereading a certain book at a given time? The answer with this one is very easy. This is a book I've read many times. It is a book that I've been wanting to return to recently and just kind of haven't quite gotten there because other things have called to me, but I was so happy to dive back in. This is a book that I find so entertaining and so joyful, but also, and I kind of forget this, most of you know also that I have a really shitty memory, but which people are like, that can't be true. And actually it is very, very true. One of the great things about that is every time I return to a beloved book, I know I'm going to love the book, but I kind of don't remember why. And I mean, I'll remember why in kind of a literary sense, but I often won't remember the plot or the characters. So everything is kind of new in this way that is just very satisfying. With this one, with this read through, I knew that it would be joyful. I knew I would be entertained. I knew that it would be interesting and engaging. And I knew that I would have such good feelings, for Julia and for Vargas. But I also just this time was so impressed by the breadth of just kind of the literary undertaking. I mean, this is a book, I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about autofiction and this line between fact and fiction and the line between memoir and fiction. And this is a fascinating case of looking at all of that, which I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. But I think that you can tell just from my animation that this is something I was really drawn into, and it is something I cannot wait to dissect with you all. The agenda today is pretty simple. We're going to talk about a bio of Mario Vargas Llosa, which is very interesting, actually. This is a time, I mean, often I don't feel like a biography is very additive when it comes to a writer. In this case, I do actually think that knowing something about Vargas Llosa really adds to your experience of the book, which is always my criterion. We're then going to talk about some of the elements of the actual novel. This is a novel, I mean, I think of it as being deeply engrossing, but also kind of light. But what's so interesting about it is there is a depth that is just very impressive here in terms of structure, in terms of form. I mean, there is a lot happening. We have one whole strand of the novel that feels very memoir-esque and feels very true, quote unquote true. Then we also have this whole other, half of the novel that is made up of these deeply entertaining and deeply troubling, in lots of cases, these radionovelas. And during this read through, I was thinking a lot about melodrama and kind of the politics of melodrama, because the radionovela, all of these radio kind of soap opera stories that we are hearing are nothing if not melodramatic. And actually, a bunch of the aspects of Vargas Llosa's life and of the memoiresque parts of the novel, the quote-unquote true, the more true parts, are also really melodramatic in a bunch of ways. I mean, he lived a life that was kind of crazy. So you get that idea of truth being stranger than fiction, but you also have this sense of what are the politics of melodrama, and why is it that Vargas Llosa, who was a very politically engaged person, why is it that he was engaging so much with melodrama? I was getting a little ahead of myself, but once again, in terms of agenda. So we're going to talk about his bio. We're going to talk about elements of the novel itself. Then we're going to talk about fiction in terms of autofiction, melodrama, and magical realism. So Vargas Llosa is part of the Latin American boom of the 60s and 70s. His writing is he's a Nobel Prize winner. I mean, the guy is a very, very serious heavyweight in terms of global literature at all. And really was one of the big practitioners of the work that made the Latin American boom what it was, which of course led me to think of Garcia Marquez and this idea of what are the political stakes of magical realism, and what is the difference between melodrama and magical realism. So it's this really interesting feat of literature, because we have a mixture of memoir together with autofiction together with melodrama. It's a very rich kind of soup of all of these literary elements. We're going to talk, after we talk about those elements of fiction, just about the function of art and the function of fiction, and then we will close. I am just looking at my notes here about the bio, because we're about to jump into the biography of Mario Vargas Llosa, a very brief one, of course. I was about to dive in, and I realized that he died recently, which I didn't even know. Sometimes I do this weird thing, like when Salinger died, I literally was like, what? He was still alive? And there was a whole thing with Garcia Marquez where there was some sort of like hoax, like someone said he was dead and he wasn't dead, or he had been. I get very confused about these huge luminaries. And honestly, like, Vargas Llosa was 89 years old when he died. And I hadn't read anything too recent by him. Honestly, I just always seem to go back to this one beloved novel of mine. Although I really do there are another couple of works of his that I really also love. But it also makes perfect sense that we are revisiting his work, to pay homage to this man who was a Nobel Prize winning, just literary genius. So I am not going to make you do the math. He was 89 years old in 2025. He was born in 1936 in Arequipa in Peru, and his parents separated just a couple of months before he was born. They told, and his mother went with him and lived mostly with his grandparents. They told young Mario that his father had died, which, is getting like a little, right from the start here, we're getting into this kind of like a telenovela kind of territory. He thought his father was dead. When he was 10 years old, his parents got back together. That he met his father for the first time. Did not have an easy time with his father. His father was verbally abusive. His father was very difficult. Suddenly, to have the re-entrance of this man who was a difficult man. Some of this information I'm getting from Wikipedia. Some is coming from an interview that leaned heavily on the memoir. So Vargas Llosa has a memoir. It's called El Pez en Agua. I'm pretty sure, Fish and Water. So some of this information, it's great to have a memoir like that because he is telling us how he felt. And certainly the re-entrance of his father into his life was not great. When he was 14, his dad sent him to a military academy. He was there for a couple of years and built up the fodder to write his really, really important Ciudad y los Perros. But he also, before that, I should back up a little bit, he learned to read when he was 5-ish. This is also, well documented. And reading for him was an enormously important escape. This really cannot be discounted. And he read widely and was really like well educated and really had a lot of contact and a lot of influences in terms of things that he was reading. By 16, he was already writing journalism. He went on to study law. Mostly he just wanted to be a writer, but he felt like he needed to have something, like kind of a fallback plan, or at least those around him felt like he needed that. But he actually was able to make a career out of writing, from a fairly early age, from the middle of his adolescence, in a way that is extremely impressive. He's very prolific. He goes on to win all sorts of prizes, most importantly, in my opinion, the Nobel. For our purposes for this book here, he marries when he is 19 years old. He doesn't meet. He knows this woman. Her name is Julia Urquidi. In the novel, Mario, our protagonist, is 18 years old and she is 32. In the real life, he is 19 years old when they marry, probably 18 when they started hanging out, and she was 10 years older than he was. She was his aunt, but not by blood, just by marriage. The crazy thing to me is that they were married for 10 years. They moved together to Europe when he went he got to study in both Madrid and in Paris. But what's crazy to me is they were married for 10 years, and then they got divorced, and he married his first cousin, whose last name was already Llosa. So we have Patricia Llosa, who he then literally like an even closer relation, and he marries her and goes on to have kids. He actually wrote his thesis, a dissertation type thing on Gabriel Garcia Marquez. They had kind of like a writerly kind of relationship, but then there was the part about how they had a falling out, and Vargas Llosa punched Gabriel Garcia Marquez in the face, which I don't know. The description of it was so funny. So they had a falling out. Things did not go well between the two of them. Importantly, after the marriage of La Tia Julia, and after the publication of the novel, Julia Urquidi herself wrote another book, a memoir, called Lo que Varguitas no dijo. So essentially like what little Mario didn't say, which is a book that I'm dying to read. I actually tried to buy a copy. One copy was $1,200 and another was $800. So let me tell you, if you've got a copy of that sitting on a shelf somewhere, you should get yourself straight to like eBay if you're interested in making a profit off of that book. I did not, in fact, buy either of those books, although I really, really was interested. From all accounts, it's like she's wanting to talk about some of the more positive aspects of their marriage and of their relationship. I would say that for the most part, it seems very positive to me. I said it at the beginning and I'll say it again. I love Julia as a character, and we are going to take a look at that as we move into the novel. So La Tía Julia y El Escribidor was published in 1977. And just to kind of put things in perspective, if they met and married when he was 19-ish, they were married from kind of 19 to 30 in terms of his ages. And then he would have written this at about 40, a little bit younger than 40. One of the things that we do here on the Fox page is, if you're here because you want to learn to like read better, which is something I resist. I don't really feel like anyone needs to read better. But if you want to gain more from your reading experience, which I do think is a good, aspiration, all you have to do is slow down and pay more attention. One of the things that I think people kind of skip right over is the title, which is odd. But diving into the title a little bit is always so rewarding. Obviously, some titles are way better than others, but most of them, if your writer is worth his salt, are going to, provide some sort of interesting yield. In this case, it is a title I really like. It's pointing out the fact that this woman who is at the center of the novel, it's really helping us understand that this woman should be at the center of the novel. So we have her at the center of the novel, but also she is at the center in terms of being his aunt. So it's La Tía Julia. Throughout the whole book, she's known as La Tía Julia. We aren't calling her, very occasionally he will call her Julita or Julia, but like whenever she's referred to in the third person, even by our first person narrator, who we are very much invited to conflate Mario Vargas Llosa with our protagonist. They literally have the same name. They have all of the same biographical data. It's very much an invitation to read this as memoir. So we have La Tía Julia, which again is like very, really putting emphasis both on the fact that she's central and that they are related to one another. And we have her by her first name. So there's a certain amount of like intimacy there. But that intimacy is also underscored by the fact that the rest of the title is Y el Escribidor. So it is it's, Aunt Julia and the writer. La Tía Julia y el Escribidor. What's important about that is we know that we need to pay attention to her, but the aspect of the protagonist, the thing that is most important about him is that he is a writer. So there is an enormous amount. In some ways, this is a book about like the romance between the two of them, but it's also like very, very clearly about the evolution of Vargas Llosa as a writer. There are tons of intertexts throughout that are an intertext is just like naming another writer or another text. Throughout this whole thing, it's kind of satisfying because in the very beginning, he talks about Borges and how he was reading the cuentos of Borges. Which just recently I did a lecture on the Aleph, which is just like such an like interesting thing to look at. But he's kind of, and not just name checking. He's really like paying not even homage. He's saying that he's been deeply influenced. It's everyone from Maupassant to Hemingway. There are lots and lots of different writers who are all extremely important. And he talks a lot about the writing process. Also a lot of popular culture. We're talking about different works of theater. At one point, he's really taken by Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. So it is very much a story about someone becoming a writer and the different ways that you become a writer and the sacrifices you make as a writer. All of that is really hinted. It's not even hinted. It's kind of like it's given to us at the very beginning by the title. The title is saying this is how we should consider these people. So on some level too, we already have kind of a power thing that's happening in the beginning. La Tía Julia is placed kind of in the domestic sphere. She's an aunt. She's a relation. She is given by the first name. And then we have him as the writer. So there is, it's not like hubris really because he's so young and he's so unsure of himself throughout almost the entire novel. So it doesn't feel kind of heavy-handed or like self-congratulatory, but it is interesting to note that he is really promoting himself and really like from even before you get to the first page, promoting this as the story of someone who is becoming a writer, and that is the important thing about the person. Okay, so now we're going to open up the book, and we have this dedication, which I really liked. So what it says is, a Julia Urquidi y Llanes, a quien tanto debemos yo y esta novela. I really like this from the beginning. It seems pretty straightforward, but what I think it's doing is showing us that there's a lot of like amicability. Like this is amicability, amiability. That they're amicable. Let's just put it that way. You have this sense from the beginning that like he's dedicating this thing to her. Like there must be, a fair amount of goodwill left between the two of them. This is not going to be some sort of like hit piece. It's really, in fact, going to be a love story. And that is part of the reason why it's so charming. I will say it again. Julia, I think, is shown in such a good light. And I think we're predisposed from the beginning to feel that because he is dedicating the book to her. We then have an epigraph stuff that honestly to me felt so kind of adolescent and silly. And I think it is pointing to something important, but I also think, again, I just think it's kind of tedious. So what we have here, it's from somebody named Salvador Elizondo, and it's from El Grafógrafo, which I don't know what that is. Okay. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because, as I just said, it's kind of tedious. Escribo que escribo. Mentalmente me veo escribir que escribo y también puedo ver que escribo. And then it goes on and on and on about, I write and I see myself writing, and I can see that when I see myself writing that I know that I'm writing. To me, I mean, I get it. Like, writing is the most important thing, and there's really like this maniacal focus on it. I'm just not sure we needed it. I mean, an epigraph, like I do this with figurative language too. I'm like, people, you do not have to have an epigraph. You do not have to use figurative language. If it's not really, really additive, I'm not sure why we're bothering. I mean, I'm coming in hot here, and that might be a hot take, and people might just think this is like crucial. To me, it felt a little bit extraneous. However, when we dive into this novel, I am so happy. There's something so charming about how straightforward and just kind of personal and intimate the whole thing is right from the very beginning. One of the important things as we're diving in here, the narrative stance is pretty straightforward. So what we have is a first-person narration, and I like that. First-person narrations, I mean, it sounds very basic, but in some ways they're very intimate because you have a conversation whenever a writer is writing in the first person, meaning I did this and I did that. Right away, you have an assumption as a reader that you are being spoken to in a very intimate way. It's like a two-person conversation, and it right away assumes a you. So when they're saying I did this and I did that, like whether or not you as the reader are really conscious of it, it's very flattering because you're having like a one-on-one conversation here. It's just you and Mario. What's also so appealing about the beginning of this book is we have some kind of nice scope. It's like he's telling it from a point way in the future. It's a first person narrator for sure, but it's giving this kind of broad stroke, like this broad kind of canvas that we are going to be working on that feels it feels warm and it feels intimate, but it also feels like we're going to get a whole story. And also, honestly, if you just pick up the book, you know that you're going to get a whole story. Vargas Llosa said this amazing thing at one point that when he was young and he was reading novels, they would always be serialized, that he was reading them in these magazines that were circulating throughout South America. And so he had like these serialized novels ended up being really long. So he had this idea in his mind that like a good novel is a long novel, which I honestly love. Like I am a fan. You all know recently from my lecture on Wuthering Heights, I'm not a super great fan of the 19th century novel. And I really don't like the idea of Dickens having been like paid for every word or like paid by the word. To me, that led to, well, this is like literally a theory I developed when I was 14 and they were trying to make me read David Copperfield and I was not into it. But, this idea of like being paid by the word, I was like, of course you're going to write these super, super long novels. But if it is a novel like this one that I find engaging and interesting and like relevant to my life, which I'm not exactly sure why. I mean, this story is deeply romantic. I find this way more romantic than Wuthering Heights, which, I mean, people could argue with that, but Wuthering Heights is a weird book. And to my mind, not a great example of like passionate love. This, on the other hand, I find like a very engaging and interesting and like kind of inspirational look at love, kind of like, defeating the odds. So all of that is to say that right at the beginning, although actually I'm going to say one more digression because it goes along with this idea of Vargas Llosa as a young reader. One of the things that he said that was so interesting to me is when he was young and he was reading these very long novels, that in his mind, there were no models for being a Peruvian novelist. There were no novels. He mentions Ecuador and Bolivia. There just were not, there were not a lot of writers in those countries. So in many ways, what he goes on to do is something that's very difficult because he didn't have any models for it. He would have had Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who's Colombian, who was publishing kind of simultaneously with him, a little bit ahead of him in some ways, I think. I mean, the chronology there gets a little wacky. I can tell you certainly that Borges was publishing before because Borges is like a precursor to the Latin American boom. Borges also, very importantly, you can find out much more about this in my lecture on the Aleph. Very importantly, Borges introduces this idea of like this global literature. He was educated in Europe, as was Vargas Llosa. And both of them really, the writing does feel very global. It does not, I mean, there is an enormous amount that has to do with regionalism in South America. It's very, this novel, La Tia Julia here, we have a lot of regionalist stuff about Peru versus Bolivia versus Argentina. So you have, there's a very serious sense of like national identity here. But Vargas Llosa's work as a whole, he spanned all sorts of different geographical locations and really was not kind of fixed in one area. But it's really interesting to note that when he was young, he just didn't have models, although he just knew he was going to write some really long books, apparently. So we're going to finally now dive into looking a little bit at the opening of the novel. We're not going to do a ton of close reading here. I think on some level, this is a novel that's more interesting, at least for our purposes today, more interesting to talk about in terms of its concepts and in terms of how it's structured and what it is trying to do, more so than looking at the prose. But I do want to get some sense of it because I find the prose so, it's so open and it's vulnerable and it's easy to read. It's very chatty. It's very colorful in the best of ways. We really feel very deeply grounded in Lima in a way that for someone who has never been to Peru, it's a very illustrative way to take a look at a city that I do not know and to really learn a lot about it. So there's a lot of specificity, but it's given to us in a very straightforward way. This is not prose that's trying to be hyper intellectual like Borges, or is trying to be really Baroque in lots of the ways that Garcia Marquez is trying to do. So you'll get a sense of kind of like the straightforward nature of this prose that also I think makes it feel kind of timeless. I mean, this is a story that could have been written, like very recently. It really, in many ways, feels kind of timeless. Okay, in terms of prose, not necessarily in terms of what he is telling us. So right at the beginning, we have this. En ese tiempo remoto, yo era muy joven y vivía con mis abuelos en una quinta de paredes blancas en la calle Ocharán en Miraflores. I'm realizing that I'm going to be reading this in Spanish. If you are not a Spanish reader, I'll give like a little recap, but I'm not going to try to translate this. Actually, I'm not even going to give you a recap. You're just going to have to trust me, and we're not going to do too much of this. So what we have here is this idea that although... Now I'm going back on my word. When he says, en ese tiempo remoto, yo era muy joven. So you have this idea of him as being very young. He's making himself sound even younger because he says, yo era muy joven, I was very young, and living with my grandparents. So you have this sense of him as being very young, which is important because what he's setting up is this, this idea of a youth who is in fact a very young 19-year-old who is falling in love with his aunt. I like the idea, too, of the tiempo remoto because you have this sense of someone. I like a novel where you have someone who's much older who is reflecting on the past with like a lot of kind of, maybe it's because I'm 56 years old and I'm getting older myself, but I like the idea of an older, wiser person looking back on an experience in terms of something having been written like really freshly. And then we go on. Estudiaba en San Marcos, derecho creo, resignado a ganarme más tarde la vida con una profesión liberal, aunque, en el fondo, me hubiera gustado más llegar a ser un escritor. So right from the beginning also we have this idea that he really wants to be a writer. And then we go on, tenía un trabajo de título pomposo, sueldo modesto, apropiaciones ilícitas y horario elástico. Director de informaciones de Radio Panamericana. So right from the beginning, it's so funny to go, it's always fascinating to go back and look at a book, like the opening of any novel, to really see like where we are. Obviously, when we read the title, we understand that Julia is going to be a very important person. But really in the beginning, the first like 10 pages or so, it's very, very much about these radio stations. So the novel takes place in the 1950s. It's important to remember how important all of these radionovelas are. So these are, they're like soap operas that are being read on the radio. And then, of course, they are kind of the precursor of the telenovela, which is a distinctly, at least in my mind, anyone who watched Jane the Virgin, I loved that show so much. It was kind of like a send-up of the idea of the telenovela, but this is a distinctly kind of Mexican and South American phenomenon that really is like, it's such a good study of melodrama. Obviously we have soap operas in the United States too, or we used to. I wonder if they still are going. I don't know. For a while I was really like a pretty ardent watcher of General Hospital. There was one summer where I really, really dug in. But so right from the beginning, we have this idea of the radio, and we have the idea of, so what he is doing, Mario is doing at the beginning is not, he's never writing the radio novelas. He's like pulling together, he's like a producer kind of a thing. And the people he's working with are mostly doing like news briefings. But you have this idea of all of these different art forms, all of these different ways to tell stories, whether it is producing, like real life news issues, which is so interesting to see how they're like picking and choosing all of these different things that they're going to announce, or whether you have something that is fictive that is really capturing the imagination of a lot of people. In all of these cases, whether it's literature or whether it is the radio, what's important there too is that the words are the only medium. So once we get into the movies and once we get into, the telenovela, then of course you have a visual that goes along with the whole thing. But this is kind of this unique era where a whole entire, they also had the sound effects, of course, that were going on. The descriptions of that in this book are so amazing. But you have this idea of words as being supremely important and creating, escapist opportunities and reasons for consolation and inspiration. I'm really like investing a lot here in the radionovela, but certainly it was something that was enormously popular for good reason. So one of the main people who we hear about in terms of all of these radionovelas is the writer of them, whose name is Pedro Camacho. And right from the beginning, we have Pedro Camacho is linked with Julia in this way that is subtle but very interesting. So Mario hears about this kind of phenomenon, this prodigy of the radionovela, and then we have this. Recuerdo muy bien el día que me habló del fenómeno radiofónico, porque ese mismo día, a la hora del almuerzo, vi a la tía Julia por primera vez. Era hermana de la mujer de mi tío Lucho y había llegado la noche anterior de Bolivia. Recién divorciada, venía a descansar y recuperarse de un fracaso matrimonial. So I love so much too, like this is a family that's very kind of upfront about a lot of things. It's also interesting to note that Vargas Llosa himself had an uncle named Lucho. So a lot of this stuff is just like very clearly autobiographical, which on the one hand doesn't seem that notable, but for a book that is so deeply concerned with the idea of making art, it is so interesting to note that we are really being invited here, if we know anything about the biography of Vargas Llosa, which we would. He's a very established person at this point already. He's 40 years old. He's been publishing for a while. But you have this sense of being invited to kind of to look at the question of like, where is the line between memoir and fiction, and why is this being written as fiction? He could have written it as a memoir. And more importantly, why is it interesting to put this idea of this kind of memoiristic novel together, like intersperse it with these like hyper fictionalized, like hyper melodramatic chunks of text that are these radionovelas? In fact, this is the perfect segue into this idea of melodrama. So just a quick definition of melodrama. Melodrama begins it doesn't begin in France, but like the idea of kind of melodrama as we think about it, like heroes and villains and like women in distress and like women being tied to radio tracks, to train tracks and like being, like saved at the last minute. So melodrama really trades on this, I think I'm thinking of like silent movies there, but melodrama trades on this idea of exaggeration of things being like really far-fetched in lots of ways. So in any melodrama, you're going to have plot that's pretty unlikely and far-fetched. When you think of melodrama, you can just think of the soap opera and it kind of fits in perfectly. So you have all of these kind of strange coincidences. Oftentimes you'll have people who are related to, like they didn't know that they were brother and sister, and then they find out that they've been married for 50 years or whatever. That's not a great plot that I just came up with right there. But you have this idea of these kind of far-fetched plots, this idea of coincidences being revealed in interesting ways. As I'm saying all of this, I'm realizing that in many ways this is similar to the Gothic novel. And having just read Wuthering Heights and thinking a little bit about that movie version of Wuthering Heights that's being put out, I haven't seen it yet, by Emerald Fennell. There's a lot of the sort of Gothic novel, which is a long-standing literary tradition that's being kind of like funneled into the melodrama. But so melodrama, we have a lot of black and white thinking. So that you've got heroes and villains, and you have people who are like very clearly good and very clearly bad, which is what we mean by hero and villain. But this kind of black and white thinking is really potent where fiction is concerned, and because it allows people to really like there's no, you don't have to think about how you're feeling, and you don't have to like think like, is this person good, and is this character like, should I be sympathizing or not? It's very, very clear how you are meant to feel about these different things. Oftentimes it's very moralizing too. So you'll have questions of like fidelity or like murder or, you know, like high stakes stuff that the author is weighing in on, because and very kind of like clearly and effectively, kind of, because it's also kind of a light sort of entertainment. I mean, this is not like Crime and Punishment here, but we have this idea of this kind of like exaggerated thing as being very easy for people to understand, and it can be often, because it is surprising, it can often be very like exciting to read. It's very good in terms of propaganda, which is interesting, or not really propaganda, but it can really hold a lot of like political weight, in the sense that you know, when you're trying to get a political idea across to someone, you want to make it very simple. You want to make them it's very clear how they should be thinking about something, who they should be sympathizing with. So it is writing that can really hold a lot of political weight. This is interesting because Mario Vargas Llosa was a very political person. So in his life, toward the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, he was a real like supporter of Castro. But then when the Castro regime jailed a poet named Padillo, and at that point, a lot of the kind of intellectual supporters in South America realized that the Cuban regime did not stand for what they wanted. And at that point, Vargas Llosa had been a communist supporter and then really moved to the right. I don't love to think about how far to the right he moved. He's known, as a kind of like your archetypal kind of liberal, which again, these are terms that these days, I think of myself as being firmly progressive, but these are slippery terms in lots of ways. But certainly he was someone who was center right. And he, in fact, ran for president of the country, which tells you he was someone who was deeply involved in politics. So what is happening in the kind of memoir side of things is actually very kind of quaint and sweet in lots of ways. We have a young man who's an aspiring writer who's kind of hearkening back to Maupassant and these deeply kind of literary models that he is hoping to imitate. And then he's in love with his aunt, but things are very chaste. It's all very hand holding and going to the movies and not barely even kissing each other. It's a very kind of innocent and chaste kind of thing that is happening throughout the whole entire front story. It's kind of interesting that it's not more boring. It really isn't. I found it just very engaging. But what's interesting about the book is when we have the radionovelas, which are absolutely manifestations of melodrama, lots of good and evil, lots of weird coincidences, lots of really recondite plots that are just very confusing. But a lot of those are taking, and as we move through the book, they're getting kind of more and more exaggerated and more kind of creepy and more crazy. And in fact, we know that Pedro Camacho is heading toward, well, we don't know it until after we find out, but he is in fact heading toward what is kind of like a crisis. He's really, what we're seeing as our young Mario is becoming a writer, his journey toward being an author, we see the breakdown essentially of Pedro Camacho. But in those stories, some of them were hard to read. We've got some real questions about race and questions about corruption and questions about sexual orientation. There's some aspects of it. And it's a tricky thing because you have to remember that Pedro Camacho is writing these. It is not Mario Vargas Llosa. Obviously it is Mario Vargas Llosa, but he's writing in the place of someone who is purposefully melodramatic. And we don't really know the politics of Pedro Camacho because he's so maniacal about writing that all he does is do this. And, purportedly he is doing this just to entertain. But some of the themes that he is hearkening, that he is using, are actually really volatile and interesting. So as the reader, you have to kind of keep in mind that the political weight of some of this melodrama, and he's not leaning super hard. We're not talking about communists and fascists. It's not that simple, and it's not that kind of on the nose politically. But there's a lot of stuff about social expectations for people and about societal standards that are really like interesting to look at. The melodramatic parts of the radionovelas, like the radionovelas themselves are totally unhinged. They're so interesting. I sometimes would get a little bit frustrated because I wanted them to be more continuous. I wanted them to be more structured. Frankly, I wanted to know what was going to happen. Each one of them ends with this crazy cliffhanger, and we don't have much resolution. I mean, one of the fascinating things is the structure of this book, because you'll have the cliffhanger and then, 100 pages later, or sometimes like 10 pages later, you'll have some mention in the real world of something that does offer a kind of like a conclusion to whatever the story was that Pedro Camacho was using. So one of the fascinating things is you have Pedro Camacho is hearing bits and pieces of chisme, of gossip, from people around him. And he is spinning these small pieces of information that are just kind of everyday facts about people. He's spinning them into these like really exaggerated, really colorful and kind of, like unhinged, sort of stories that he is telling that usually don't have a complete arc. And that is so deeply in contrast to this like very sweet kind of love story that we are watching unfold over, 500 pages, but it's moving kind of slowly and very much in a linear fashion and in a very kind of straightforward plot kind of way, which is really a fun thing to contrast with the kind of hyperbolic nature of the radionovela chapters. So I have in my notes here that I wanted to talk about intertext and about the humor in the book. And then we wanted to talk about the depiction of women in this novel. But I think in some ways we've talked enough about the intertexts and the influence of all these different writers. And, just to name a few more, like he's going everything from like Petrarch, from like ancient, Italy, all the way through, I hope it's Italy. Is it Italy? I'm pretty sure that's right. Laura and Petrarca. But then all the way to Buñuel, who's like the Mexican movie maker. So we have this really broad and very large thing that stretches all the way from, like ancient poetry all the way to like filmmaking in the 50s. It's very wide reaching in ways that are really excellent. And it really is a great example of like how it is that Vargas Llosa is becoming the writer that he is. It's also a very funny book. I have found, I was going to read a couple of the things, but first of all, they're in Spanish. So for people who are not Spanish readers, that might be a little tedious. But also a lot of the humor is kind of subtle, and it's not like, it's a little bit hard to read unless I'm going to read a whole entire passage. It's very funny. There is a lightness to this novel, which is probably why I was attracted to it at this moment. There is a lightness that comes from, and the humor is it's not like broad, crazy slapstick humor. It's very witty and interesting and well done, but it does in fact feel very light. Julia herself is actually very funny. I did want to take a couple of looks at things like when we see her being a strong person. So one of the things that I loved throughout this is she does feel strong. She feels like someone who has agency. She has, she's not kind of like, she doesn't like, she's not needing him in any way. I'm struggling to even say this because it's like so kind of like not part of who she is. She, at one point, she's dating other people. She's like, am I interested in that guy? I don't know. She's also someone who in the 1950s in like Bolivia had the wherewithal to end a marriage that wasn't going well. So this is someone who has, again, a lot of agency and who cares deeply about her love life and is not going to just like kick back and be married to I mean, I don't know what was up with her former husband, but clearly she wasn't happy there. And so she left. So, but we have, in the very beginning, we have this sense of her as being definitely older, which is important, but also as being kind of sassy in a way that I love. And again, it's so interesting to go back and look at this because the first time that he's meeting her, she's just come to Peru, and they've spent the whole night. She and her sister and brother-in-law have spent the whole night, up reminiscing and drinking and whatnot. And in the morning, she's in her like slippers and her robe and her hair curlers, and she's unpacking. But she's very happy to like say to have this young man in her orbit. She's also really not taking him seriously at the beginning, which is so good because this is setting up kind of a power dynamic where she's just really like not. She really is in a really strong position of power that she maintains. So what we have is this. La recién llegada en bata, sin zapatos y con ruleros, vaciaba la maleta. No le incomodó que yo la viera en esa facha, en la que nadie la hubiera tomado por una reina de belleza. I do think of her as being very beautiful, but, like she's like, hungover and she's been up all night and she's in her hair curlers. Okay, and then we hear, this is the first thing we hear from her. Así que tú eres el hijo de Dorita, me dijo, estampándome una vez en la mejilla. Ya terminaste el colegio, ¿no? Which is so funny to me. Like, she's literally like, so you've graduated high school, right? Which is such a, the poor guy is like feeling like he's older and he's now like he's studying law, but he's also has this job and he's working hard. And she's really just like kind of putting him in his place. And so she says, ya terminaste el colegio, ¿no? And then we have a paragraph break. La odié a muerte. So it's so good in the beginning. Of course, this is also kind of a melodramatic thing. Of course, there's like a lot of hatred. I mean, it's not actual hatred. He, in fact, is drawn to her at the beginning, but he's like, I hated her. I hated her to death right here at the beginning to set up this kind of tension. But again, it's because she has power. He's reacting to her power. And a little further down on the page here, la odié a muerte. Mis leves choques con la familia en ese entonces se debían a que todos se empeñaban de tratarme todavía como un niño y no como lo que era, un hombre completo de 18 años. Which is so funny. I mean, it's like I was a man of 18 and they're treating me like a child. Nada me irritaba tanto como el marito, and that's in italics, calling him marito. Tenía la sensación de que el diminutivo me regresaba al pantalón corto. And then we have his uncle say, oh no, he's already studying law. And then we have this crusher from la tía Julia. La verdad me dio el puntillazo la tía Julia, es que pareces todavía una guagua, marito. Una guagua it comes from the Quechua guagua, which is like for a baby. She's like, you're a baby, marito. I also think it's funny that it's feminine, una guagua. And then, of course, she uses marito, una guagua, marito. So we have from the beginning, and fairly soon, he's like, you cannot call me that. And there is this really nice tension. But what's important here is from the beginning, we have this idea of her as having power, and that endures. Throughout the whole entire thing, she truly is the one who is kind of calling the shots in a way that is not only appealing to a 56-year-old woman, but like meaning just like that someone in this very patriarchal, very kind of machista society would have some power, but that it is being acknowledged right from the start here by the protagonist, and that it's like not only is it acknowledged, but it's developed throughout the whole entire thing in this beautiful way, because she's really she's maintaining her power, but she's also like including him in a way that makes both of them seem powerful. Like they're not seen as ridiculous because she is coming from this place of agency, which I think is so, it's just very important in terms of what the novel is saying. There are actually so many different like chunks that we could read that really show this kind of agency, but I just want to look at this one because it really, it's indicating like a larger life that she is considering. So this is a time when she starts dating this older man, and apparently he's someone who's not interested at all in sexual relations, but he is very wealthy. So what she says is this. Si estuviera segura que se va a quedar siempre así, me casaría con él por su plata, decía inescrupulosamente la tía Julia. Pero, ¿y si yo lo curo? ¿Te imaginas a ese vejestorio tratando de recuperar el tiempo perdido conmigo? Which is so funny. So essentially she's like, if he was always going to be asexual, I would totally marry him for his money. But if I cured him and he was like going to try to make up for lost time, like, no, thank you. So this is a woman who is talking about like marrying for money. She's talking about female sexuality. She's talking about male sexuality. There's so much inherent power here because she's like, I might cure him. Like I might actually make him a sexual person, even though he has been asexual for a long time. And like, that would be terrible because he'd be wanting to make up for lost time. Presumably he'd be very like unskilled lover too. You get the sense that Tia Julia is someone who's really invested in herself in the sense of like her own priorities and her own quality of life. I loved this so much because it's also so pragmatic. And she's speaking here about issues like marrying for money and sex, which are not like, these are not kind of, topics of normal conversation, in this kind of like upper middle class society, and certainly not between like an older woman and a 19-year-old young man, which is part of why it is so charming and so interesting. So again, there are many, many points that we could look at where we are seeing this kind of agency and kind of strength from her, and this candor and this sassiness, that all of it, I find her so appealing. Okay, we're gonna start to close here. I want to talk for a minute about as I promised, about the difference between melodrama and magical realism. So it's so interesting for me as someone who's read a lot of Spanish literature, a lot of French literature, and a lot of Latin American and Mexican and Central American literature. I think there's a very compelling reason to understand that magical realism is something that grew very organically and I think very effectively out of Latin America. So in Latin America, you have this really potent mix of this like colonialist and anti-colonialist sentiment. You have nature that is extremely powerful and that is like providing kind of like almost like supernatural things. Like it is like the rainforest is providing, fodder. It's not like a story that's written on the plains, in the Midwest of the United States. Like there's so much going on and so much growth and so much kind of talk about agency. Like that is a jungle that has a lot of agency. It is a landscape that really has like a big impact. I mean, I guess you could argue that like the snowstorms and the wind and whatnot, the tornadoes in the Midwest also do too. But this is a place where the geographical location and the kind of like lushness and the altitudes and the giant rivers, like it is a place where nature is really like playing a big role. It also is a place where politics have always been, I mean, I say always, like since the first contact, since we had like all of those like colonizers coming from Spain and mostly from Spain, but also from Portugal, you have all of these forces coming in and eradicating indigenous peoples who had like these incredibly like well-developed and sophisticated and interesting societies. Like it's like a clash, that's been going on for hundreds of years that's like extremely volatile. You also have a regionalist thing that's very strong. So, in the United States, we have a lot of regionalism, but it's not like the regionalism between these different countries in Latin America. So I think things like melodrama and like magical realism, one thing they both do is they do a good job of thinking about or like portraying the strangeness of life. So in both cases, both in melodrama and in magical realism, we have this exaggeration. Things are happening that are not normal things. I mean, this is not writing like Winesburg, Ohio. It's not. I'm really like focusing here on the Midwest, which is probably not fair. It's not even like East of Eden. I mean, a lot of like that's a big sweeping novel and lots of stuff happens in that book, obviously, but none of it is like exaggerated or supernatural feeling that you don't have crazy coincidences. I mean, this is all like probably arguable. But the point being that both melodrama and magical realism really traffic in these ideas of things that are astounding. Both of them have a political charge if they want to. With magical realism, a lot of it has to do with looking at like the nature of something, and whether it's like how you're going to set up a town. In Macondo, like when we have in 100 Years of Solitude, we have this idea of this mythic town that is like the beginning of a society. So it's very political in terms of like what it is up to. All sorts of craziness, of course, ensues. Then with like Isabel Allende, then we have that same kind of exaggerated stuff, that same kind of supernatural things that are happening in the world of the novel, but she's placing it even more clearly in Chile. So we have someone like El Poeta and El Médico in that book. Like those are very clearly people like Neruda, and we have the idea of a dictator. All of those people are getting kind of more concrete, which I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here. The point being that magical realism serves a very important political thing because it is fiction. You're not criticizing any certain regime, but what you have to say says a huge amount about what is happening politically in a given country. You also have that with melodrama. I mean, sometimes it tends to be more kind of like interpersonal, but it has a lot to do with like the way that people are like acting in society, what is okay to do in society and what is not okay to do in society. It's very, in many ways, it has kind of like a moral charge, which you also see with magical realism. It's interesting to contrast both of those with detective fiction. Detective fiction is so fascinating because it's inherently conservative. Like you have someone who is solving a mystery, things are kind of put to right in a way that is really reinforcing the idea of whatever kind of patriarchal societal norms you have your criminal pushing up against. So there's this interesting way that a lot of detective fiction is, and thriller kind of stuff, it tends to be kind of politically conservative in a way that when you have melodrama or you have magical realism, it can be, it's much more, you have a lot of different ways that it can manifest. It can be much more, not necessarily like conservative, not necessarily wanting the status quo to stay the same, but really questioning what the status quo is all about. So crucially, the difference between the two is that when you have melodrama, like, yes, things are happening that are kind of outlandish. Like you find out someone has amnesia. There's always amnesia. Someone gets hit on the head and they have amnesia, and then they wake up and they realize something crazy, or they realize that they have that twin brother that they've been married to for 50 years, or whatever the thing is. They're things that are surprising, certainly, but they're not things that are supernatural. In magical realism, you have things that are happening that are not within the realm of possibility. So if you have, a million butterflies that are coming and raising someone up, or the example I like always is when Ursula is finding out that one of her sons is dead, there's like a little bit of his blood, a little trail of his blood, and it leaves his body, and it's like zipping across town, and it's like jumping over things, and it's like, going across the street, and it arrives at Ursula, and she is not, she's not like, oh my gosh, what is this trickle of blood? Like, it doesn't seem strange to her. What happens is she understands that her son is dead. Or when you have that giant magnet that's being pulled through the town in Macondo, and it's pulling out all of the like hinges and all of the nails, it's important because we're talking about whether or not progress is a good thing. It's symbolic, but no one in the town is particularly like astonished by it. Like no one thinks that this is just like something that is completely impossible. So the key with magical realism is that strange supernatural things are happening, but people within the scope of the book are not particularly shocked by them. They are meaningful. What is happening is meaningful, but they are not striking people as like completely impossible things. That's more fantasy. Or science fiction. So if you have things that are happening and they're supernatural and everyone's like, oh my God, what's going on here? That's much more of like a science fiction or a fantasy kind of thing. These are subtle distinctions, but they are important because they're really different in terms of how the reader is meant to feel about what is happening, how the characters are responding, and certainly it influences what you can do with these things, kind of how political you can be in kind of covert ways, or whether or not you just are meaning to be entertaining, or whether or not you're talking about progress. Like there are lots of different issues that you can bring up very effectively with all of these different genres, but they're distinct in ways that are very interesting. In the case of, and here's where we'll close, in the case of La Tía Julia y el Escribidor, what we're talking mostly here about is this idea of this love story and the idea of a writer becoming who he is. So when you have the idea of this kind of memoiristic novel that is it's a very straightforward narrative that is happening between the two of them and their families and their coworkers, all of that is very straightforward. What happens when you have these kind of melodramatic, like really outlandish things that are, but not supernatural, outlandish things that are happening in these other chapters, these alternating chapters, it's reinforcing the idea of the kind of like the realness of the story of Julia and Mario. So if you have these outlandish things happening and they're in contrast to the other thing, which they are deeply in contrast, the one feels the story with Mario and Julia seems so kind of normal and mundane and down to earth because it is in comparison. So we have this kind of outlandish life that Mario Vargas Llosa led with, he thought his father was dead. His father didn't turn out to be dead. His father comes back and his father's a total villain. And then, which all of those are very kind of melodramatic things. He's being raised by his grandparents. He's finding escape in literature. He's meeting a woman who is 10 years older than he is, who is recently divorced. She's from a different country and falls in love with her and carries on a really, in many ways, a very successful marriage, then marries his first cousin. All of these different things are kind of the ilk of the radionovela or the radio or the telenovela. But because we have something that is so much more outlandish that is going on in the actual radionovelas in the novel, everything that is happening that is outlandish in the kind of quote unquote real world is seeming much more realistic in some ways. It's so fascinating. So we have all the different layers. We have Mario Vargas Llosa as the author. We have Mario Vargas Llosa as the protagonist. He has all of his family members. They have all the same names. They're all in Peru. A lot of the same kind of biographical data. But he's making it fiction. But then you have this extra layer of fiction that's kind of like more fictionalized in the form of these radionovelas. It is a fascinating look at like a story within a story, which is an ancient thing, and the different ways that these different things play off of themselves and really I mean, it's very impressive to me that the kind of like more kind of crazy hyperbolic thing that is happening with the radionovelas, it doesn't take away from the kind of more mundane love story. In fact, it makes it really comforting and rich. So this is a work of art that is really playing with the idea of all of these different ways to think about art, and it's broadening the scope in a way that is showing us that all sorts of different forms of art, whether it is Buñuel or whether it is Death of a Salesman on the theater, or whether it is the radionovela, or whether it is these short stories that Vargas is beginning to write, all of these different acts of art are serving different purposes, and all of them are showing like the real potency of literature and of art, and the ways that it can transform lives, and the ways that it can help us understand things that otherwise seem a little opaque. So I think that's probably a good place to stop. It has been so fun to take this deep dive into La Tía Julia y el Escribidor. I hope that for fans of the novel, that it's like deepened your appreciation for what Vargas Llosa is up to. This is absolutely one of his kind of like easier and kind of more kind of frothy books, which is probably one of the reasons I like it. But I am always impressed by the depth of what he is doing and how successful he is at it. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.